Good evening. Welcome to Sankofa Videos and Books. Appreciate your patience and thank you all for joining us this evening. Round of applause. And so again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for Contemporary Uganda, Museveni's Rule, Leadership. This is going to be a discussion with Olem O'Brien and Milton Alamadi. Round of applause for them. If you've missed any of our past events, you will find a quality edit of those events on our YouTube page. Search Sankofa Videos and Books on YouTube, or you can search for the channel name Sankofa VB. Special shout out to Abel and Bemnet for their great work as camera people and editors. And so let's see, we're just gonna get straight to it. If you miss any of our events, of course, as I said, you can check out our YouTube channel, and to know about our future events, sankofa.com and Sankofa DC on social media to check that out. Let's see, and so what we've got coming up, Gaza on Our Mind is going to be coming up this Sunday from 7 to 9. It's part of the On Our Mind series, which chronicles and documents and highlights all the different conflict zones that are of relevance to us as Black people. So from Gaza to Haiti, Congo, and what is my last one? Sudan. Also a very important one. So we have that going on 7 to 9 tomorrow. And of course, we're celebrating the life, the legacy, and the works of Baba Malcolm X. And so the 19th, which is his birthday, we'll have an event then. This will be part of a 3-part series starting on the 19th. Then again on the 22nd, we'll have Dr. Carr. We're going to have a birthday celebration. And then finally on the 30th, we'll have a discussion with one of his close comrades, A. Peter Bailey. And so definitely check us out for that. So few quick rules of thumb before we really get started with this event. If you could, please put your phones on vibrate or silent if possible. And also, if you have any questions, if you're doing the Q&A and you're part of Q&A, hold the microphone like this, not like this. Going to make sure to just have everybody heard and make sure everybody is projecting clearly for the cameras to catch. So other than that, that's pretty much everything I've got going on here. So without further ado, introducing to you the discussion, Contemporary Uganda, Museveni's Rule, Opposition Politics, and the Struggle for Decolonized Leadership. A discussion with Olem O'Brien and Milton Alamadi. Round of applause. Enjoy the show.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. For those who might not be aware, this is part of a series, and this is our 3rd series. My name is Joanna Mpasso. I'm part of the 625 movement. This is a group of young Kenyan people who are interested in learning about their history and their politics. And we started out, of course, with the Kenya series and wanting to understand our own country, and have since branched out and have collaborating with the Ugandan community and learning about our neighbors. And it's incredible how much we don't know about the people that are right next to us. I'm honored to be joined by Olemo Gordon Bryan. Olemo is a Ugandan community builder working at the intersection of economic development, faith, and African governance. He is a former Hesper USCO scholar. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and political science from the University of Notre Dame. His early leadership includes serving as head prefect at St. Mary's College, Kisubi, and attending the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg. He later spent 4 years with Future Africa driving public leadership and policy reform, and became a Young African Leaders Initiative Fellow. To empower youth in continental politics, he founded the 4th Generation Initiative in 2021 and Aluta Press, which is a youth-focused publishing house. He also directs speaker curation for TEDx Mac Youth, and recently authored his first book, Leaders and Schemers, A Political, Intellectual, and Spiritual Itinerary. And he'll be telling us more about his book as we go on the conversation, but let's give him a round of applause as he comes on stage. Our second panelist is not here yet, and he may be able to join us later, but we'll just get started with the conversation. And, is there anything you'd like to add? Say hi to the Sankofa.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Olemo, and I'm excited. This is a very lovely space. I'd never been here before, so it's really, really an honor to be here on this stage, and I look forward to the engagement.
Thank you again for joining us. We're going to get started with our discussion. So when we in our last conversation, which was 2 weeks ago, we left off in 1986, Uganda. There had been several coups d'etats at this point. We had Milton Obote come in. He was ousted.
The thinking that undergirds that initiative is that we are the fourth in generations of leaders, successive generations of leaders in Africa that are trying to advance the same cause of the African Revolution. And this statement is important because it will help us as we scaffold who Museveni was, the politics that he lives by or he lives for, and what he's trying to achieve. Now, the young Museveni, as you pointed out, was doing the same things that we are doing today, of trying to conscientize ourselves, trying to raise our level of political awareness in order to be able to have an impact on society. He always says something that he did not enter into politics because it was something fashionable to do. He entered into politics out of necessity. Otherwise, he would have been a philosopher or he would have done something else with his life. But it was necessary that he enter politics. Now, you pointed it out well that he attended, university at the University of Dar es Salaam, which at the point was a hotbed for leftist intellectuals on the continent who were there. And so the training was predictable. The tools of analysis, Marxism, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, obviously those were what was in vogue, the intellectual ideas that were in vogue in such spaces. I think people also know that he wrote his undergraduate thesis, which has circulated a lot, on Fanon's theory of revolutionary violence, which he said he was testing in the liberated areas of Mozambique. So he grew up in that kind of intellectual and in that kind of atmosphere of African states. You remember at that point the Lusophone African states, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Angola, they were still fighting for their independence from Portugal, right? So he had the opportunity of witnessing that struggle in Mozambique with a group of his friends. So that was the kind of training that he had. Later on, he was able to involve himself in government in the country. He worked within the state, and then that is how he was able to, start having those early exposures. Of course, it's important to point out that he was an early admirer of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, in the country that he was growing up in. So that influenced his politics a lot. Up to now, the man is over 80 years old and he still references Mwalimu, right? Mwalimu's politics, Mwalimu's politics of integration. I remember when the NRC, and we'll get into this in the conversation, when the National Resistance Army later on took on power, they invited Mwalimu to Kampala to come and lecture them on the direction that the country should take. So he has always looked up to Nyerere a lot, who at that point,
Could you give us a little bit of how Museveni finds himself in Obote's first government and
one government that was in power. At that point, we talked, I think in the last conversation, it was about the coups that shaped Uganda. It's important to mention that Uganda has never had a peaceful transfer of power, right, since 1962. That subsequent governments have been, subsequent transitions have been through coup d'etat. And the Obote one regime, when it was in power, I think Museveni found his way up there. People say he was doing research in the office of the president. Others claim it was really intelligence work that he was doing. But what happened was that in 1971, when the president then, Obote, was in Singapore attending the head complexities of running an economy like Uganda's in that hostile international environment was that he did what any other leader in the 70s did, which is embrace some kind of version of an Africanization program. Essentially, transfer the properties of people who are deemed foreigners to the hands of the natives, right? But obviously, that's a misdiagnosis of the problem, because simply transferring Asian properties to the hands of Africans is not going to change the economic situation of the country. And he realized that later on. What it did for Uganda economically is that it froze a lot of the capital markets for us, obviously in retaliation to that move. The British and the Israelis who had sponsored him initially later on realized that they did not know the man that they had sponsored. He embraced a very Pan-Africanist posture and a very nationalist posture, that very anti-imperialist. Being a Muslim as well, very anti-Israel and very anti-Zionist. So it was people were very shocked at what Amin did. And so over 35,000 Asian properties were expropriated. I'm sure some of you have seen the new book by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, Slow Poison. I mean, those are some of the families that were affected at the time. And so Uganda has a sizable Asian community. So when Museveni later on came back to power, or when he came to power in 86 after the second Obote government, a lot of that work was about undoing that work in order to ingratiate themselves again to the international community.
Just to go back a little bit, so there's a deep disagreement on how those elections are run, and he essentially goes and starts out the Bush War that lasted, I think, 5 years. communities. You had communities who are part of the national resistance movement that Museveni had founded. Can you tell us more about how different this military organization Museveni had, and what was its involvement with the local community?
I have some friends we often talk to, and it's telling me that the things that Museveni did is only unremarkable in the imagination outside Africa. You know, there's a lot that happens in Africa, but when you come outside, it's almost like a footnote, right? But these are experiments that are very important. These are experiences that are very key and very informative. Now, though Museveni contests the 1981 elections in Uganda under his own political party, the Uganda People's Movement, I believe UPM, he emerged. Obviously, it was a party on the fringe. It wasn't very popular. He had support mostly from his region. What was his politics? It was really the same politics that people like Obote had. And the election was rigged. That one is a statement of fact now. And then eventually what Museveni did is that he took to the bush. Now, Obote was not a military man, right? He was a nationalist, and he was the figure that we often talk of, the fathers of the country, the people that led Uganda to independence, or at least he was the prime minister at independence. And the reason why he was susceptible to things like coups from people like Idi Amin was simply because of that he was not a military man. He was a political figure. Now, Museveni had political experience, and the loose alliance that brought Obote back to power, he was part of that group. And what happened eventually was that because it was a negotiated one, Museveni had people within government. He had soldiers and political units within the military, and so it was all about then making sure that these guys are active, right? When the need arose. So, though, what did he do? Obviously, there were different formations that were opposed to the Obote regime. Then he took to the bush within what we later on came to be called the Luero Triangle. And what were they trying to do? They were trying to do guerrilla warfare, right? And so it was about taking and liberating different zones of the country from the government and converting those zones into territory that could be mobilized towards the cause of the National Resistance Army. So the National Resistance Army definitely came from an amalgamation of different groups, mainly led by the Museveni faction. And what they did is that they trained different units within the country, and they fought against what then was a very weakened military apparatus in Uganda, in an economy that was just beginning to recover. And so because of that problem, it was easy, right? I don't want to say it was easy because it started with very few people, but he managed to militarize a very large chunk of the population and also to politicize it. And I think this is the point that is very important. That what he did with the National Resistance Councils that were formed in what he would term as the liberated zones of the country is very important. After they took power in 1986, what he did was that because he was advancing or fronting a new politics, he politicized a very large part of the country. The NRA revolution was supposed to be a popular revolution. So what the movement did is that they tried to ensure that every person in the population was involved in the democratic governance of the country. How do you do that? You organize people from the village level into what we called resistance councils. So even the person at the lowest level has a say in who represents them at the higher levels. And that became sort of the structure that contemporary governance and administration in Uganda takes on today with our local council system. So you have a local council, one chairperson at the village level, local council, two chairperson at the sub-county level, local council, three upwards, up to the member of parliament, who then goes to the National Assembly. So at that time, I don't think that anybody has managed to politicize Ugandan society as much like that. And if anybody here wants to experiment again with anything like that, you need to appreciate what was done at that time, that people were involved at a broad level. And obviously, one of the things that Museveni did, again, citing sectarianism in the country, was to abolish political parties, because he claimed that the political parties that were there were then organized along tribal, ethnic, and religious lines. DP was predominantly a party for the Catholics. You have different parties organized that the interest of every Ugandan, regardless of religion, regardless of region, regardless of tribal identity, was the same. And so we did not need multiple political parties. We just needed one movement or a broad-based government that brought everybody together, regardless of ideology, for this broader ideology of development.
So while Museveni is organizing, he comes out with now a famous document called the 10-point program. This was very socialist, very popular. It included things like democracy, land reform, etc. Could you tell us more about what Museveni was proposing for the people of Uganda in this 10-point program that was very socialist? For the people, what was he saying? As you don't have to say all 10, but what was he proposing? Is if I'm the leader, this is what I'm gonna do for the people.
So it's important to state that there was nothing socialist about the 10-point program.
Oh, really?
Right. Now, if you are a revolutionary in Africa in the 70s and 80s, where are you going to derive your ideas from? It's going to be Marx, it's going to be Lenin, it's going to be all these figures that we're already very familiar with. But it's important to mention that Museveni's was a nationalist cause, right? How do we develop the country was his main obsession. How do we move Uganda forward from all these prior years of dysfunction, all these prior years of instability? One of the things that he realized is that we need to eliminate all alternative centers of power. In short, we need a very strong state. And Museveni has stuck to that line up to now. And I'm sure he's going to do it till his dying breath, right? That to develop a country, you at the first instant need a very strong state. It does not help you if you're a country like DRC with a very strong state, with a strong presence in the capital of the country, but different rebel groups are running other sectors in the country. So he understood very well that the first thing you need to do is to promote security. Security of the individual, security of property. And those are some of the foundational ideals for the 10-point program. I mean, the other bit was democracy, of course, maintaining popular participation in the country. And then the third bit, which is very important, other aspects, was something about building a self-sustaining economy, a modern, fully integrated and self-sustaining economy, not just a neo-colonial economy that is benefiting outsiders more than it's benefiting those on the inside, amidst other programs. So I think those, and obviously fighting sectarianism as well in all its manifestations, the oppression of women, tribalism, religious sectarianism. So those, I think, were the main aspects of the 10-point program. The economic aspect, how do we rebuild an economy that serves Ugandans? And then the security question, how do we build a Uganda that in which everybody is secure, in which your life is not arbitrary? Like during the Amin regime, whereby there was something called pandagari. Any small disagreement with the president, the next day you could be whisked off. Now, that has obviously come back to bite Museveni, because people are arguing that the days of pandagari that he fought against are now back with his regime. So that is very important to point out as well. But the 10-point program was a minimum recovery program. What are we building towards, right? And we're building towards a united Uganda, which is developed, and development here is defined in terms of modernization, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And a Uganda that's also socially progressive with popular democratic participation for all and security for all involved. That was the gist of the 10-point program.
So in 1986, Museveni and the NRM, they marched into Kampala, taking advantage of a point of weakness in the current government. There had been another coup, and a new president had come in, but the country was very weak at that point. Him and his army march into Kampala. They take over government, and Museveni, he promises fundamental change for the people of Uganda in his presidency. And initially, in the beginning of his presidency, he is really not interested in working with Western powers. So you know that he was trading with countries like Cuba, countries like Yugoslavia. He did not want to use Western currency, so he was barter trading with certain countries. But only a year later, he pivots into a more neoliberal approach. Could you talk more about that?
So there's definitely a lot to unpack there. When Museveni takes power in '86, and the NRA, the National Resistance Army, that later on turned into the National Resistance Movement, Uganda, as I mentioned, had a movement system, which meant a no-party system, right? Because the president believes that the whole country had a singular objective, which is we all want to develop, right? And I think this is important. Even today, it still makes the same argument that even the opposition in Uganda and the government, we all want the same thing, essentially. Amilcar Cabral used to say, we're all fighting for the same. No one is fighting for the ideas in your head. We're all fighting for a good future for our children. We're all fighting to see our lives go forward. We all want hospitals. We all want, good roads, good infrastructure. We all want to see our lives go forward. And I think that has defined modern politics in Uganda today. Are we disagreeing over policy, or are we disagreeing over personality? For Museveni, he felt that between the different political parties, it was a disagreement over personality, right? And different grievances and not politics. Because we had all the same objectives. Now, though it's important to mention from the outset that the president from day one is a modernizer. Museveni is about modernization. What is the objective? The objective is to say, how do we transform? And he mentioned this in a 2011 interview with a Kenyan journalist whom I know you know. What's the name of this man? Very popular. I'll get his name. Sorry? No, it's not Larry Mano. I'll get his name. Jeff Koinange. Yes, Jeff Koinange. He mentioned in an interview with Jeff, he mentioned to him that the objective was to transform Uganda into the next South Korea. I was seeing an interview by the current president of Kenya. He speaks of Singapore, and everybody in Africa wants to either be the next South Korea or the next Singapore, right? So that's just to help us understand where we are going, right? So what is the objective? How do we get Uganda to become Singapore or South Korea? That is, how do we create immense wealth, redistribute it effectively, and modernize the country? Hence, transforming the country from an agricultural nation, right, into a modern industrial state. And that is still the vision for Uganda's Developmental Vision 2040. So if you want to understand Museveni and what he's pursuing in Uganda, know that modernization vision. That's very important. He wants us to become an industrial country. And so that informs his approach to politics and the social questions. Because he knows that for us to become, for you to become South Korea, you need to understand that South Korea had a Lee Kuan Yew. And for how long was Lee Kuan Yew at the height? Not Lee Kuan Yew. Singapore had Lee Kuan Yew. South Korea had, what was the name of that man? Park Chung-hee, right? So he had Park, they had Lee Kuan Yew. And these guys were all authoritarian figures by any stretch of the imagination. If that word is useful to you, they held power for a very long time. And they had and their power was uncontested largely. These were party states. So the way that Museveni has perceived of Uganda throughout the time that he has been in power is that is what we are doing. So anybody that opposes that modernization project with the NRM as the party state is in opposition to the interests of the people of Uganda. Because there's an objective that we are pursuing, so we must not be derailed from that objective. And that will also inform his longevity in power. Because he has historical examples of people who remained at the head of these experiments till they worked. Obviously, Uganda is not going to become the next South Korea tomorrow. And I think, and we will talk about this much more, one of the things that has happened to Museveni, which is very useful for you and I today, and the next generation of African leaders, is to understand why. If you have this revolutionary figure who is beholden to all these progressive ideas, who then takes on the state, manages to build a strong state by any stretch of the imagination, why has he been unable to achieve what he set out to achieve? That's an important question. That's very long-winded way to get to neoliberalism. Now, the neoliberal issue, I asked myself this question for a very long time. Why does a Marxist, embrace the Washington Consensus? It was even worse for Uganda because we were actually the poster child for neoliberalism in Africa, just like Chile was in South America. So remember that Museveni is inheriting an economy with inflation through the roof. It's coming from 5 years of civil war from 1981 to 1986. Frozen capital markets, nobody's lending Uganda. Uganda hits a debt crisis in 1991. Nobody's giving us money. We have nothing. Essentially, there has to be a program for economic recovery. The money has to come from somewhere. And that is why when the World Bank and the IMF, these international financial institutions, come to the government with this proposal to relieve us of debt, to pump or inject money into the economy, the government is very willing to embrace it. Also, don't forget that Museveni was never a Marxist. He just took the Marxist lens to understand Africa and the bits and pieces of it that were important. He will tell you that in his generation, they were part of the non-aligned movement, right? That we are not pro-West, we are not pro-East. We are pro-ideas that work for us. We are pro-ideas that move us forward. Now, if we say that we want to launch a socialist government, there's an assumption underlying there that there's wealth to redistribute. But again, he will tell you, we have to first build the wealth in order to be able to redistribute it. And for him, the best way to do that was to embrace capitalism, full scale. And so when the proposals came on board for the government to deregulate the economy, to privatize a lot of the state-owned parastatals, to reduce the bureaucracy and the size of the state, he was very willing to embrace it in exchange for the economic recovery that followed. And at some point, Uganda was growing at like 10%. It was, I think, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and some other country that were growing at those figures, and they were very astronomical. So we recovered to all intents and purposes.
I'm curious what these adjustral programs are like, because in Kenya, when they happened, a lot of these privatization, there was a lot of corruption that was going on. I think it was essentially, the president handing, state corporations to friends, political allies, etc. Is that similar to what happened in Uganda when the privatization was going on?
Yeah, so some of the tenets of definitely, I think that was a big issue in Uganda as well. Some of the tenets of the structural adjustment programs was that we had to obviously privatize, a lot of government-owned enterprises. And the rationale was that the state is not a very productive actor, right? And that the private sector should be the driver of the economy, that the state has no place in providing some of those goods, think electricity, water, and some of those things, which later on turned out to be quite misguided in some aspects. Obviously, this is where the rot and the corruption then came in. There's a man called Andrew Mwenda who now advises the current son of the president, who is the chief of defense forces, and his political formation, the Patriotic League of Uganda, I think that's what they call themselves. Andrew Mwenda, he has a lot of scholarship about how the corruption and the rot that was involved in this privatization program. Obviously, a lot of the people who ended up buying these parastatals from the government on the cheap ended up being those who had political connections. Those around the president, those around, who we call the historicals now, the people that fought in the Bush War and had some kind of political clout in the country. So there was definitely a lot of corruption in the disposal, or at least in the privatization of these, government parastatals. And that's well documented.
Is there any land reform that takes place once he takes power? Any form of land reform?
Yeah, I think there wasn't much initially in terms of land reform. A lot of land in Uganda is privately owned. That has not changed. What has been happening a lot in the country is that there's an effort to make sure that land becomes titled. And obviously there's been a lot of conflict between customary land ownership and this new leveraging of titled land and reform that the government is bringing up. But that's just because that's because of the monetization of the economy, essentially. That everything that you want, if you want to go and have access to capital, to finance, is going to be linked to the assets that you own, right? So a lot of the land reform has been headed in the direction of how do we pursue, capitalist development within this country, but there was nothing significantly that was destabilized. Maybe, as I mentioned, there was the return of the Asians and Asian property. The president was reflecting on that recently in Kenya as well, in a summit, the Africa We Build, that the first thing that they had to do was to bring back the Asians. And why did they bring back the Asians? It was for political goodwill, essentially.
Okay, so we have a Museveni coming in, very revolutionary, very tries to barter trade, tries to trade with non-aligned countries, or countries that are not the West, essentially. But he gives that up pretty quickly. He realizes that we're broke and we need money. So has this capitalist angle persisted to today? I think you mentioned that now the focus has been turning Uganda into a full capitalist state, right?
Yeah, I think if the Ugandans like to talk of Musevenomics, it's not any unique economic thought, right? I think people like naming economic theories after themselves as if it's very unique, but it's just this set of policies about urban and rural development. How do you boost household incomes, but also general thought about the economy. Now, Museveni, you can say, has embraced a mixed approach to the economy. Later on, he has realized the futility in full-scale privatization, and the state is now coming back in very important sectors of the economy. Obviously, initially, it turned out that he realized that you have to play the game that exists if you want to play the game that you want. That however radical you are still radical within a particular environment. I think Marx is the one who said that men make history, but not under self-selected circumstances, right? There is a situation that you meet, and you have to work with that situation to advance the cause that you want. A big part of the NRM strategy to develop and industrialize the economy has been about attracting capital, right? Boosting investor confidence, bringing back the Asians, building the infrastructure in the country, promoting peace and development, which definitely is a sine qua non for economic development, has largely been about how do we attract FDI? How do we attract foreign capital to come into the country and then to modernize our country? What we are having today, which I think Kenya also does as well, and even Ethiopia, I think Ethiopia has really perfected the experiment, is the experiment with industrial and business parks. How do we create these independent zones of industrial? I think there's a documentary out there that you can watch called Made in Ethiopia. It talks about the Chinese influence in those industrial parks, right? Yeah, how much work is going on there, but also just the challenges that people are going through. If this is the direction that we want to take, are we trying to become the next China? Can our people manage it? Because I was seeing that documentary and people were working for peanuts. I saw someone was saying somewhere there that I would rather go and, in Uganda there are a lot of roadside vendors. I'd rather go and just start my small business there, selling chapatis or anything there, bread or anything, than work in this industry for peanuts, right? But that is the goal that we're trying to pursue. So the economic strategy of the NRM largely has been around how a mixed approach. How can the state get involved in strategic sectors, right, in the commanding heights of the economy? So we are now maintaining things like the Uganda Development Bank. And the president was reflecting recently about how he was misguided to privatize key government parastatals. So it's been mixed. How do we attract foreign capital? But he has been very big about private property remaining sacrosanct. So protecting business that is coming in, protecting the interests of multinational companies, and protecting the interests of those who are bringing capital into the country, and making sure that they have as easy a life as possible. So Uganda has ridiculously long tax breaks and very low taxes as well for people who are coming to establish industries in the country, different kinds of favors, but that's the game that we are all playing in Africa. Rwanda is doing it, Kenya is doing it, Ethiopia is doing it, Uganda is doing it. We are all trying to see who can be the most beautiful girl for foreign capital in this entire economic pageantry.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what changes that Museveni does to his military, because he had been there had been coup after coup after coup in Uganda, but there hasn't been any in the last 40 years. What changes did he make to the structure of the military that has redefined that situation?
So we must not forget that the Uganda People's Defense Forces, which is the name given to Uganda's army, was an offshoot of the National Resistance Army that fought the guerrilla struggle. So essentially it was Museveni's army, right? Or the army that brought him to power. And that is very important because it's going to help inform after Museveni whether this army maintains a national character or not. Will it be an army that is subordinated to civilian control and that can... I remember one of the generals made a very problematic statement. It was just a very careless statement. He said, oh, if Bobby Wine, who is now the leading opposition figure in the country, becomes president, I'll not salute him. And that informed sort of the attitudes within the army, which is quite dangerous, you know, because we need a national army. And I think that that's what Museveni succeeded in doing, is that he succeeded in the first initial years of the NRA or the NRM rule. The initial task for him was, how do we sort of pacify the country? So a big part, up to the early 2000s, was fighting different rebel groups that were in opposition to the NRM. So before we could even talk about development, he had to eliminate all these different groups. There were rebel groups in the north of the country where I come from. The Lord's Resistance Army was there for some time, committed lots of acts of atrocities against the population. You know, there were different movements. There was the Holy Spirit movement by Alice Lakwena, different groups that came up, right? There were groups in Western Uganda. So a big part to build a strong state was, how do we build an army that is able to stave off all these opposition in the whole country? And the NRM, Museveni did it very well. He managed to, you know, centralize power, essentially, within the UPDF. I think the innovation that came in later on, obviously, it's good for him that the army was built around or with the people that came to power with him. Now, eventually what happened is that now he had to come up with coup-proofing strategies. Now, all of you who are familiar with African history, you know that the military is the biggest level of power. And he understood that very well. And obviously, he had the benefit of historical experience as well. So what has happened is that people will now point to fragmentation within the army. We have different military outfits and different formations within the army doing different things. And so there's a lack of coherence, essentially. So you have like parallel armies operating within the system. And that means that there is no general, one general who can stand up one day and say that, oh, I'll take on the state, because you will not be able to mobilize the entire armed force of the country, which I think as a coup-proofing strategy goes a long way.
I think something else I read while reading about this was he essentially integrated a lot of these people who were even fighting him. I think some of Obote's children are in his government, so he integrated a lot of the people who would have been potential leaders into his government. And maybe that, you know, some of the side effects of that is that there's a very large group of leaders and politicians in, because there's a lot of political favors being given, right? I think you have so many new members of parliament added just so everyone is under this, under the government and receiving some kind of benefit from being under the presidency. That way you have no incentive to want to come against him. Is that correct?
That's very important, Joy, to point out that the biggest question in development is, how do you overcome collective action problems? That's the question that Lee Kuan Yew faced. That's the question that Park Chung-hee faced. How do you overcome inertia from how do you mobilize the whole country essentially towards one agenda of development? If we've figured out that what Uganda wants to do is modernize, right? That we have an economy whereby I think by the time in 1995, about 62% of the country's exports were mainly coffee. And then later on, the services sector has grown, but a large part of the Ugandan population still remains employed in agriculture. But we want to modernize, we want to industrialize the country. How do you do that? It means that in the first instance, you have to bring people together to work around that agenda. Now, the trick and where history will judge Museveni is how he has managed to do that, right? How do you form a ruling coalition, essentially, and a national consensus? How do you bring business? How do you work with the tribal leaders? Because remember that before Museveni, Obote had banned, and I think I saw this in the previous conversation, Obote had banned kingdoms in the country, particularly because of the experience with Buganda. Now, Museveni did something. He restored kingdoms when he came to power, but then he depoliticized them. That means that nobody can mobilize in the country politically along tribal lines explicitly, which I think is a good thing, right? That you shouldn't be able to mobilize people just on the basis of tribe. It should be a developmental agenda that you foreground. Now, or along religious lines for that matter. So a big part of it has been, how do you integrate all these interests into government? And what he has done, people will now accuse Museveni of embracing patronage. That the biggest thing that he has done is that he has so many people on his payroll so that they are all working towards this agenda. And so he, from the beginning, and that's very important, he maintained a broad-based politics. So the NRM has always been conceived as a big tent party, right? That is, think about it as a church. That means regardless of your beliefs, regardless of anything, we can bring you in as long as you believe in this project. You may be a socialist, you may be a capitalist, you may be a traditionalist, you may be whatever ideology you espouse, but come into this project so that we modernize Uganda together. And so throughout you've seen lots of opposition elements have been integrated into government, and that's partly why Uganda's opposition politics is very weak. Because on the one hand, they have failed to realize a coalition the way that you normally do in Kenya, right? Where you have so many coalitions that come up. They are weak individually, but they don't unite. And what the president has so successfully done is that whenever he identifies some element within the opposition who is willing, they bring them into government and they give them a position. And that has happened over and over again, right? And I think that is one of the reasons why the NRM has remained as strong as it is, that they keep bringing in different elements, so there's buy-in from large parts of the population. Whether that coalition holds after Museveni is a whole different question altogether.
So, in the early 2000s, I think he does something very interesting. He does two things. He completely removes term limits, but reintroduces multi-party politics, which he had initially banned because he said that they promoted sectarianism. So he does these two things all under one vote, right? He says, okay, you're going to vote to extend remove term limits, but I will now bring multi-party politics back. What is the strategy behind this?
I think initially, it's important to mention, I think the president did not appreciate how much time it was going to take to do what he wanted to do, right? That is, how do you, one, pacify the country? Then also legitimate your rule. How do you justify to people within other parts of the country that you should be the right party to lead the country in this development agenda, right? And it takes time to do that. So when the movement system began, the movement system again is the no-party system. Other people will call it the one-party system, with the NRM being the movement. It integrated all opposition elements, right? The DP, which was the main opposition party then, was in the movement, so it had a representative in the National Resistance Council, which was the biggest organ of the movement. But remember that also this is the turn of the century. So the Soviet Union falls at some point there is definitely and that motivated neoliberalism as well with the Washington Consensus and everything. But you see these greater pushes for democracy around the world. And this was part of the crisis that faced even the people that we call the newly industrializing countries, the East Asian tigers, essentially. At some point, they had to democratize. And that's part of why you really cannot very neatly replicate the East Asian model in Africa now, is that there is the question of sustained leadership. How do you sustain leadership? So there are pressures to democratize the country in Uganda. And so he yielded to those pressures eventually, and then multipartism came into place, right? Because different parties went out and people wanted to contest elections. But I think he also had a keen appreciation that his work was not yet done. So he still needed to remain in the party. And that's why subsequently or simultaneously, presidential term limits were removed to allow him to continue to contest power and for the project of the NRM to continue. So it was like a compromise.
Okay. To the democracy, the pressure for democracy, which is something very similar that happened in Kenya in the 90s with our former president, Moi. So there hasn't been lack of opposition and very strong opposition, right? Starting in the 2000s with Kizza Besigye. We know that he was in the NRM. He was, if I'm not mistaken, he was one of the people fighting during the Bush War. And he's a very close confidant. He's his doctor, essentially. But there's a fallout, and he becomes one of the key opposition figures in Uganda. Can you talk about this fallout and why he's able to garner so much support from Ugandans?
So there's a book by a journalist from the Daily Monitor, one of Uganda's leading newspapers, called Daniel Kalinaki. The book is called Kizza Besigye and Uganda's Unfinished Revolution. It gives some kind of insight into the man's politics and how he came about. But just to help us, now, during the struggle, the 5-year NRA struggle, Museveni had a doctor in the bush who also helped them a lot, Kizza Besigye, who, when they came to power, became the national political commissar of the party at some point. So he was in charge of political education, essentially. And then he was also a minister in government at some point. Now, it reached a point where people felt, just like many do today with the national liberation movements in Africa, that the movements are derailing. You find the same discontent with the ANC in South Africa, the same discontent with Frelimo in Mozambique, the same discontent with, different formations, CCM in Tanzania, right? Whereby people feel as if, despite all the rhetoric of developmentalism, which these parties are foregrounding and advancing, and the nationalist cause that they represent, they're not living up to it. Because either power has become personalized, or there has become a ruling coalition that has become comfortable. And they are now just becoming leeches on the state. They're becoming parasites, and they're just eating from the state and not advancing a national cause. And so all the offshoots, all the parties that came from the NRM, that was the same grievance. And so at some point, Besigye produces a document that he sends to the highest organ of the party. He decries problems within the party. I think they're not taken seriously. Also, the problems with the person of the president himself, who at that point it felt like he was personalizing power a lot, that the country was not living up to the democratic ideals that it had propounded. And so that is where the name, I think, Forum for Democratic Change comes in. Different people who are dissatisfied with the politics of the NRM from within and outside, who then came together to form this party and coalition to challenge the NRM and propel a democratic agenda for the country. So the biggest dissatisfaction was that the NRM had derailed, essentially, from the goals that they had set out in the 10-point program and in the constitution, which was promulgated. That was one of the biggest successes of the NRM, by the way. They promulgated a new constitution in, I think, 1996. Yeah, after large and wide-scale consultations around the country. So that was where then the figure was the person who has been most prominent in opposition to Museveni in his 40-plus year rule. That's how he came about, Kizza Besigye. He came from within the NRM itself, right? So much of the terms with which he speaks, even when he speaks about the personalization of power and how entrenched the president and his family are, it comes from that appreciation and that closeness. Of course, people talk about how personal and intimate their relationship was, in that his wife was kind of, had a relationship with the president before in the bush and things like that. But yeah, that was the genesis of the man, Kizza Besigye.
We know that he vied for elections several times, either 3 or 4 times, but he's unsuccessful. And Museveni really uses the machinery of the state to crush his campaigns, his elections, etc. What can you say about? We know he removed the term limits, but then he also has the monopoly on violence with the army, and how he uses that against the supporters, against any kind of mobilization that Kizza was having. And we know that he's in prison right now in the Ugandan military. And maybe you could also touch on military courts and how those have been used to circumnavigate the regular courts that everyone uses.
So you are Lenin, right? You are Vladimir Lenin, and the Bolsheviks have taken Russia in October 1917. What is the next course of action? You essentially have to eliminate all the opposition, because for all intents and purposes, the communist or the socialist revolution that you are leading is for everyone, right? Land to the people, bread, and all of these things. So that is the sense in which Museveni sees himself. You must always understand that to understand the NRM, they see themselves as the revolutionary party, the party that advances the nationalist and Pan-Africanist revolution. Museveni, we should not forget, is a Pan-Africanist. Very ardent advocate for continental unity. He has been very consistent in that politics from day one. Now, so that informs how he treats and views opposition in the country. Anybody who comes up to oppose, the UPDF here is now the guardian of the revolution, right? It plays that role. That means that anybody who wants to come up, they are mobilizing against the president. They are an enemy, not just of the state, but they are an enemy of the Ugandan people. And so when anybody comes up in the opposition subsequently, that is always the thinking, that you are derailing us from this project that ought to move forward. And so you'll be met with the brutality of the state. Now, in Uganda, there's freedom of speech. That means that anybody can come and talk about anything. Sometimes we can say that with limits, right? Somebody joked that, I don't know if it was an African president, we can guarantee freedom of speech, but we can't guarantee freedom after speech, But though, so you do these things at your risk. But the state is strong, so you have to be very careful about the things that you talk about. But people talk about the president and the rot in government all the time. I think what he has learned, and this was from experience, when Museveni was mobilizing in 1981, he was dismissed by then sitting president, Dr. Apollo Milton Obote, as a group of bandits, right? And then those bandits ended up, succeeding him. So he now knows that his strategy is that we nip the problem in the bud. So any small uprising, and this informs some of the laws that we have enacted that limit freedom of political association. So, for example, you have to take permission from the police in order to gather in a certain number. As long as you start mobilizing groups of people politically, there will be a spotlight on you, right, from the state. If you go and just make noise and talk, they will leave you, right? But if you start mobilizing the population politically, then there will be a spotlight on you. And that is why Kizza Besigye suffered a lot at the hands of the state. He was tear gassed so many times, He almost lost his life. That's how he came to Kenya for the first time, because he had started to mobilize. I think in the aftermath of the 2011 elections, I recall he mobilized, I think, the walk-to-work protests, where he decided that they would be walking to work. And because he's a popular figure in Kampala, which is a metropolitan area, which is a hotspot for his support, it paralyzed sort of operations. And so the same things have always been met with brutality. So that's how to understand the president and how he deals with the opposition, is that when you come up, you're opposing the revolution. And the best way to deal with enemies of the revolution is to deal with them decisively. And so, obviously, some things happen, and I just think it's outright impunity, like trying civilians in military courts. Like, that's just very unnecessary, and democratic, because they're supposed to go to civilian courts. But I think because military courts are much faster, and we cannot argue against the phenomenon of the personalization of the state. A lot of decisions are micromanaged from State House. And I wrote my undergraduate thesis on this, about presidential parallel governance in Uganda, that there seems to be a whole different state that exists at State House where the president resides, a military, system, and economic decision-making, military decision-making, all kinds of decisions. First start from there, even for the party. Right? Because don't forget that the president, Museveni, is like an all-knowing figure. He's a chairman of the NRM, he's the president of the country, he's the commander-in-chief of the army, he's the chief ideologue of the NRM, he's the chief theoretician of the NRM. He's everything, right? And the problem is that over time, even the people around him are proven very impotent at thinking. So what that has done is that all those around him normally just defer to him in terms of thinking. And that has made him very indispensable to the NRM revolution and the future of Uganda. So a lot of decisions are taken from government, and the way that opposition has been dealt with over the years has been in a military style.
So we know that he was just kidnapped from Nairobi a few years ago. I know that the last time he vied was not in the last several years. So he's still being pursued by the state. Why?
Obviously, I think he was the government always maintains a close eye on him. He's being treated the same way that the state treats people like Bobby Wine, who is now in this country, self-exiled, I think, for the moment. So whenever you have the capacity to mobilize the population, as I told you, you always be an enemy of the state. And so one needs to be careful. I believe, I don't remember what the empirics of the case were, but I think he was caught in possession of a gun somewhere, and then they felt that he was going to Nairobi to counter-mobilize against the government, so they snatched him back very quickly, and I think he has now been interned somewhere in a dungeon, somewhere, which speaks to some of the problems in the system. But that is the thinking. I want to go back though to Besigye, his decision not to run again in 2016. The man contested President Museveni 4 times, and he concluded that it's useless to contest the man at elections. By like the 3rd time, he realized that the best thing that elections do for the opposition is that it gives the opposition a chance to speak to the population and to talk to the population about the ideas that they represent. Because during the normal course of affairs, you can't, as an opposition candidate, you just can't go and organize an event somewhere. In this country, people were organizing all those No Kings protests and everything. No, you can't do that in Uganda, right? Because the state is going to... Because even the campaign season itself, you're already hamstrung by the strong repressive apparatus of the state, right? So even the campaigns themselves, there's all these... there are presidential elections that basically ran from prison, So, and there's one where he was accused of rape and all these charges, and then just to hamper his campaign, and then later on he comes out. So he realized that elections are useless. But I think the missed opportunity, and he has pointed to this several times, is that the Ugandan opposition has consistently failed to unite. And yet none of them, as a party, is able to take on the NRM state, even in a free and fair election. The NRM, for all the things that the state does, is very popular and has very entrenched grassroots support. I was just seeing something on Afrobarometer. Museveni has like a 68% approval rating in the country as president. And many Ugandans see in the NRM this party of national development and reform, and this party that represents them essentially. So it's not like this is a very unpopular party with no support at all. We can say they meddle with elections. We can say there is manipulation of elections at all levels. The president even claimed in the aftermath of the last election that it was the opposition that rigged, and he gave us figures for that. But the understanding is that the opposition in Uganda has consistently failed to unite, and that has been their biggest undoing.
We'll shift gears a little bit and touch on regional politics. So Uganda has been heavily involved in neighboring countries, and we know that the East and Central region of Africa has been in turmoil, and that in itself deserves a greater scope of discussion. But one of the countries that we'll talk about quickly is Somalia. So Uganda was the first nation to deploy troops to the AU mission, and this was in support of the U.S. war on terror. They are leaving now after 19 years in Somalia, and we know that the Ugandan army formed the backbone of the coalition of going into Somalia. So how has the Museveni government leveraged this military alliance with the West? One, to maintain domestic power, and are there any economic benefits that have come from specifically this engagement with Somalia? I think there's been discussion that these engagements with the West shield him from its diplomatic leverage, right? If he's able to, if he's able to ensure regional stability, then democracy isn't really a priority for a country like the US, or at least regional stability is more important than maybe them calling him out for any kind of democratic suppression.
Yeah, so I think it's important to... Now, Uganda sits in a very volatile region, right? We have South Sudan as our neighbor to the north, but before, when the NRM was coming to power, it was in South Sudan. There was just the Sudan, right? With all its internal turmoil with, what's the name of this man? Bashir, initially with all his confused politics. And then we have the DRC to the west, which has been a very big problem because a lot of the rebel groups in the region ran to the DRC. And since what happened to Lumumba, we all know what the politics of that country has been in terms of managing a strong state. There has never been a strong DRC state, right, that is able to superintend the whole country, right? The state normally just comes, you know what's happening in Kinshasa, and then that is the seat of government. So it's a big problem. Now, though, I'll preface this to understand Uganda's role in the region. Now, because we're a very stable country. You can't take that away. Uganda, one of the things that people credit Museveni for is stability. We're a very stable country, work is going on. You can't just come and bring anything, because we have a very strong police and military force. Now, and what has happened over the years is that because we have kept on training and building that army, it has become involved in a lot of the local conflicts around, right? And maybe we'll talk about Museveni's Pan-Africanism in a bit, but he's quite committed to that. Now, it's very important to mention, I normally see Bobby Wine, Honorable Robert Chagulanyi, is here in this country right now, and he goes around, he laments about the US and how the US is the one that is propping up the Museveni regime, how they should call out the regime, how they should stop supporting the regime. But all of us know that the American regime is very two-faced, right? But most importantly, we know that it's a country which pursues its own interests abroad, right? They're not a pro-democratic country as they like to label themselves. That's just a label. right? Because we know that they have supported several authoritarian regimes around the world as long as it's in their interest. The US foreign policy is just their interest. It's a pro-American foreign policy. America first is America first, whether it's under Biden, whether it's under Obama, whether it's under Trump, it's America first, right? It's what is within the best interest of our country to pursue abroad. And so in America's fight against global terrorism, which obviously comes with economic benefits, comes with diplomatic benefits as well for the country, you've often seen Uganda getting involved. And part of that fight in Somalia meant that Uganda contributed troops, right? But it also coincides, obviously, with Museveni's own appreciation of the value of a strong state and also his Pan-Africanist politics as well. The understanding that Uganda has a role to play in the stabilization of the states around him. Because remember, if the states around Uganda are unstable, then that instability will eventually come into the country. Kagame, who is quite a factor in the region, often speaks about fighting preemptive wars because Rwanda is unstable. What that has meant is that it has just meant instability in DRC, because then he has externalized his wars there. So that same strategy, that's the same thinking that Museveni has, that our region needs to be stable, because if it's not stable, then it's essentially going to become our problem. We've seen that Uganda is the biggest host of refugees. In Africa, we host the highest number of refugees, and in the world, we are the third most gracious host, if that's the thing, with third highest number of refugees. I don't know how to put it, in the world. So we know that if the countries around us are unstable, if Kenya is unstable, where are the Kenyans going to go? They're going to come to Uganda. You don't want to come to Uganda. So essentially, people are going to come to Uganda. And the whole region is like that. So Uganda was the biggest contributor to the African mission in Somalia, the African Union mission, peacekeeping force there.
Just
and
a
we've
quick
had
question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned he's Pan-African. I'm curious if, so this outward military policy, do you think that it fosters or does it undermine communities like the East African community or IGAD?
Now, though Museveni has always been a proponent of an East African force, I think he has always had a keen appreciation of what continental unity should look like. I don't think he's not a proponent of the Nkrumahist vision of one continental superstate, right? But he's more a proponent of economic cooperation continentally and more of like regional economic grouping. So he's a very big proponent of the East African community, which is this coalition which started with Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, but now includes the DRC, South Sudan, Burundi, and Rwanda, right? Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, yeah, and now includes Burundi and Rwanda. So I think we've not had a standby force for a while. Like there's no East African force. If there's an East African force, it's always going to be the different African countries contributing. And we've had that force come up in different conflicts, right? But it's more of a voluntary participation. Maybe there's an intervention in DRC that's necessary against a terrorist group, or maybe in Mozambique, or in Somalia itself. It's always going to be these different countries contributing forces under the name of this East African, force. But there's never been a well-structured kind of East African or African army to that effect.
Just one quick question. So right now, what's been really interesting is that the DRC, the president of Congo, is working together with the president of Uganda, at least officially, and that Uganda has been building a lot of infrastructure in Congo. A lot of roads, there's talks about a refinery. So what's going on there? What is this collaboration with? Because we know, with the history, it hasn't been a very smooth history between Congo and Uganda. We know that Uganda and Rwanda worked together to overthrow at least two presidents. And then there's conflict between Uganda and Rwanda on the resources in Eastern DRC. But now we see the President Museveni working with Congo on a new project, which is oil, I hear, in the lake. Is it Lake Albert? Yeah.
So Museveni's policy is one of enlightened self-interest, if you want to call it anything. It's what's in our interest to do. Now, he is a keen appreciation of the collective progress of African peoples, right? That we must move together. So collective infrastructure projects. I don't know if you listen to him in the Africa We Build Summit that happened in Nairobi recently. He was talking about collaborations that we are going to build. There's a planned refinery, I think, in Tanzania that is supposed to serve Uganda and Kenya. So there are all those there are highways that we've built. You remember the SGR railway, the standard gauge railway project that was built that was supposed to connect these countries. Also, don't forget that Uganda is a landlocked country. So we don't have direct access to a seaport. So that means we need to either we need to maintain at all times very good relationships with Kenya. That means, Joy and I have to always be very good friends. And with Tanzania as well, who are the chief, countries through which we have access to ports to bring in our goods and also to transport them out, And so that has informed Museveni's engagement in the region and even his interventions, because the appreciation is this. It's hard for us to think about how we can work together economically if there are fights in our house, right? If we are thinking of Africa as one, he normally uses the illustration of one household with different rooms, and the different rooms are closed off from each other. So Uganda is the sitting room, Kenya is the bedroom, or the living room. Kenya is a bedroom, another, is another room. So, and all these people need to work together as households, but we are closed off to each other. But you see, if there's conflict in our home, then she's not going to be thinking about the larger project of African unity. There's an internal contradiction that she has to first deal with. And so that is partly also what informs Uganda's intervention in these regions. Now, have they always been smooth? No. Obviously, there is always, in the Congo, I think there was looting of minerals at some point by certain elements within the army, and Uganda is still paying for it right now, and different issues like that have arisen in different conflicts that we've intervened in. But Uganda is definitely committed, and I think we should be, to collective projects to develop the region, because that's how we progress. We have Uganda exports a lot of electricity to Kenya as well, right? Because we have different hydroelectric power dams in the country, and so we sell electricity to Kenya. We produce a lot of food, so we sell that as well across the region. A lot of maize always goes through the border to South Sudan, we have a better climate than them. So a lot of food goes from Uganda to there. So there is definitely benefits to thinking regionally and continentally. Yeah.
Something more current is with what's going on in the U.S. So you mentioned that Museveni is all about, what works for Uganda and what is in the interest of Uganda, right? So Uganda has gotten into a deal with the U.S. and they are accepting immigrants who are being deported by ICE. And Uganda is one of the places that has signed a pact with the American government. What's your take on this? Well, he says they have to be of African descent. They cannot be from other places. But he has signed a deal to accept. Is this in the same line of self-interest?
So there's what is my take on it, and there's what he might be thinking. There's like things as they are and things as, maybe they ought to be, right? There's a difference there. So the things as they are is that the president is not very sympathetic to Africans living abroad, right? He does not think that there's any reason why Ugandans want, or anybody in Africa should want to live elsewhere outside the continent, right? But the point is simply about obviously there's the overall romanticization of anywhere but home, right? Which can be problematic. And then there is also the fact that we have a lot of our people dying in the seas. I think we all know that. People trying to cross into Europe who are just dying and out of desperation, all these things. So he's not a very big proponent. He's a proponent of let's be here and let's develop now. Do conditions always map perfectly to that? No. Inevitably, people end up outside. And it's not just because of economic desperation. People are outside their countries for several reasons, right? So he has used that as an ideological justification to accept it. But we all know that there is definitely an economic boon that comes from being in cooperation and being a collaborator with the U.S. regime. Yeah.
And one last thing about this. So something else that's been really going on in Uganda, and I've seen it a lot on the internet, is the anti-LGBTQ laws. Very famous meme from Uganda, "Why are you gay?" Right? It's funny, but underneath it is some of the strictest and harshest anti-LGBTQ legislations. So they say it's not African, right? So that's kind of the popular discussion around it. It's not African, etc. But when you look at the money, I was reading about this, that American Christian right-wing groups have spent at least $54 million in Africa, and nearly half of that in Uganda, to influence local laws and public opinion. So the face of anti-LGBTQ is local African leaders, but behind it is American right-wing groups that have put in up to $50 million in Uganda. So,
well, I mean, that's new information for me. I didn't know the influence of like right-wing groups here, but I'm also curious as to whether that would be necessary for those legislations to pass in the first place. There's definitely, generally in lots of African societies, a very well-established stigma and a perception of, let's say, homosexuality and all of these practices as being unnatural, un-African, and an imposition of the West, right? It's definitely perceived strongly as an aberration, right? That this is not how we do things. And ultimately, when you think about a parliamentary system, the parliament will reflect, and it will reflect the opinions of the overall majority. Obviously, it doesn't always map perfectly, but that is what that legislation often comes from. That there is this large group of people, there's these societies. Now, two things are very important here that I need to point out quickly. One is how Museveni approached it, particularly the last bill and the first one. And also, secondly, the fact that we've had two legislations like that. The first attempt to pass the anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda, I think, was in 2013. And after the bill, 2013 or 2011, I remember Obama was still in power. And when we did, and when we passed the bill, I recall that the USA said that if Uganda went on to pass it into law, there were going to be sanctions, right? Hard sanctions, and they cut off some aid and everything, and somehow that bill just disappeared. So that tells you what it means to actually be truly independent, whether or not you agree with, the bill or not, right? It just shows you how much independence you actually have to frame and make your own laws in your country without external influence. And then maybe the other thing is just how the president approached it. I think it was remarkable because he's a very patient man. So he held lots of consultations with people around him. Okay, is this natural? So he tries to not always go with the opinions of the masses, which I think leadership should be about that. That sometimes the people as a collective can be wrong. And so leadership takes the boldness to say that, okay, I've investigated, I think you guys like this, but that's not the position that we should embrace. And he concluded from his consultations that it was a product of nurture and not nature. And so the bill was eventually passed. Yeah, but it was definitely obviously popularly supported both by the people in the country and by the members of parliament.
We'll take a quick break for questions. back.
Thank you so much for this super insightful conversation. You were keen to explain the rationale for a strong state, right? And there's no doubt that strong states are good at generating growth for a country. But I think the question is always, how well is that growth redistributed? You know, the Chinese model justifies itself by poverty alleviation and things like that. And even the more left capitalist states like Singapore, the strong party there has been able to build strong institutions that translate a significant amount of this growth to its own people. Enlighten us on the economic record for what the Ugandan strong state looks like. Have those gains translated into things like jobs for young people and poverty alleviation, or does it does the state justify itself through pure, pure brute force? Is this broad system of patronage that you're describing cannibalizing that growth, or are the people at the margins really feeling the benefits of that growth?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a very, very key question, and one that I was thinking about a lot when I was an undergrad student. What are the prerequisites for development, and how does it translate? I think it's important to preface by saying that if you think about countries like Kenya and Uganda, these are very poor countries. Now, they're not poor in terms of resources, they're very resource rich and very wealthy, but they don't have money. You know, you look at the last budget that we passed in Uganda, more than 50% of that budget is going to debt reservicing. So the money that we are collecting, which, by the way, we collect less than 40% of our budget from revenue. So there is no money. You know, money needs to come into the hands of people, right? So when we talk about redistribution, we must first even ask ourselves, what are we redistributing? Now, obviously, there's an elite that is accumulating. There's an elite that is misbehaving, particularly in Uganda. We're now having problems with our speaker who loves expensive cars and expensive clothes and things like that, right? So there's that elite that has its own conspicuous consumption and things like that. And even parliament itself, you know, which spends a lot on itself, right? Contrary to what should be in a country that is poor, like Uganda. But I think... so does the rationale for authoritarianism match the economic record? Now, and I think this is why political economy thinking is very important. Sometimes we think about things in silos. We think about things independently. But remember that we gave the historical trajectory, that the NRM was in power for some time, and then they mobilized. They had to fight several rebel groups up to like the early 2000s, and then a lot of the recovery that happened, you know, and the 10%, you know, economic growth that we were experiencing, obviously translated into a lot of poverty alleviation as well. But many people will argue it's just because, we were talking about this before, that it's just like a situation of a child that has been malnourished for a very long time, that you gave them a little food and now they look like a normal baby, does not necessarily mean that they have, you know, grown, right? They have just come back to normal levels. If you are at negative 15 and you come to 0, you've just come back to normalcy, right? We're not talking about you coming to 15, plus 15 on the scale. So I think the question in Uganda right now, poverty reduced a lot significantly. A lot of people were lifted out of abject poverty, reduced. Uganda did very well in the fight against HIV/AIDS. You know, we've done very well, I think. The government has tried in providing, you know, universal primary and secondary education to everybody to ensure that people are enrolled in school. You know, we've provided different healthcare provisions. The healthcare system has been quite, you know, health center ones up to the hospital for every district. So the infrastructure is there. The question that now is being asked is the question of quality and availability of resources. Now, because our lives are leveraged by the West, we can't deny that. Like, our budget is almost more than half of it is funded from external sources. You know, I've already told you the story about Obama and how they cut US aid funding to help people who are living with HIV, and we felt it. So we had to take back our bill in order to receive this funding from the West. So we can't take away that reality that we are very heavily dependent on the outside for our progress, but I think there's been some economic progress that has been registered. But because of high population growth, youth unemployment is still rife. A lot of people are still working in the informal sector. And the general features of, I would imagine, a post-colonial African country working in the periphery of the global economy is still, still inherent in the country.
Hi. I wonder if you could speak a little more to the foreign policy agenda of Asian countries that are trying to bring back into Uganda. From what I understand, that most of the expulsion was exclusively of these South Asian overlords, but you're installed by colonizers. But I'm assuming there's been a greater level of diversity with regards to who Museveni was trying to bring back into the country to invest, not just South Asia, but East Asia. And, I'm very curious about where Gulf states may come into play there. Would appreciate if you could speak to that a little more.
So, Mom, just to get you clearly, you said the foreign policy agenda? Of
Foreign policy agendas of various Asian actors and how that's worked out for Uganda. How they've contributed or not contributed to the development, or failed to contribute to the development of Uganda. If you feel like they've met Museveni's expectations, what were his expectations? What have they, these different constituencies from various parts of the Asian continent, what role have they played during?
Bringing back the East Asian communities that have been expelled.
South Asian, East Asian,
Okay.
Gulf states. Just, I'm curious about that piece of the puzzle.
Yes, no, that's a very important question because obviously there are animosities on the ground. Sometimes people will talk about how Asians, and obviously all of them in most cases will be collapsed into Indians. That subtlety, the lack of subtlety is always there. But the thinking that Asians run the economy, right, in Uganda. Now, there were not a lot of, and the president was illustrating this in Kenya recently, and he was saying that there were 35,000 properties that were expropriated by the state under Amin. And then when the Indians were brought back, or the Asians, were brought back, the properties were taken back. were given back to the people who had them. And he was saying that they have over 40,000 properties, but now the Ugandans, because of the economic development that has ensued since, now have significantly more properties than even those owned by by the Asian population in the country. Of course, they still form a very significant, very big part of the Ugandan middle class, and also of the Ugandan business and private sector, because I think most of our biggest billionaires here, you think about people like Sudhir, they belong to that Asian community, right? The Meta group, people who are dealing in, very high value manufacturing. Most of them are of Asian, South and East Asian origin. So it's definitely been both empirically in terms of the economic contribution itself to manufacturing, to business, but also in terms of just the diplomatic lens, right? Because it showed that the NRM was a reformist government that was nationalist and anti-imperialist in rhetoric, but they were willing to work with people. They were not an extreme and radical government that was willing to, redress the historical past. So it brought us a lot of... Museveni recently called it, used the Swahili word, kisirani, that those Asians were just bad luck for us, so why not fix the bad luck, essentially. So that's the thinking, yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk, and thank you, Joy, for your questions. I thought your conversation about the politicization of Uganda and how Museveni, one of the things that he did effectively was propagate popular involvement from across socioeconomic lines, where people in the village to people across socioeconomic lines could have a say in how they're represented in government. And I wanted your insight on other factors that may cause disproportionate representation in government, factors that may be still contributing to barriers of people from various tribes and religions being represented in government.
Yeah, so when you look at, thank you for that question. So when you look at the National Resistance Councils, right, or the Resistance Council, and then later on, subsequently, they became the local council system. It's very well spoken of, even by academics, right? When you read academics who have commented on Uganda, they will say that there has never been this level of democratic mobilization in a country. Hence what I said at the start, that what the NRM achieved in Uganda is remarkable by any stretch of the imagination and deserves to be studied, right? But because it's a country in East Africa, somewhere there, with these 40 million black people, sometimes those things end up being relegated, right? And that's why platforms like this are important, to talk again about those things. Now, though, they definitely managed to mobilize, and one of the things that the government has done was the affirmative action was a big policy when the movement came into power. So ensuring, for example, that every district, in a very definitely patriarchal country, right, that ensuring like every district has a woman representative in parliament. Now, people have complained about quality vis-a-vis just visibility, things like tokenism, I think. You know, the fact that you can't blame the man, like our current, the former speaker in the past cabinet. The former speaker was a woman, vice president was a woman, the prime minister was a woman as well. So, and he has been very, the president has been very, just very intentional about ensuring that all sectors in society are represented in this new government. You have representation of people with disabilities for every constituency, again, in the country. You have youth MPs for every region as well in the country. So at least in the composition, even the army is represented in parliament. Our parliament is very big. I don't think it should be that way, but we have over 529 members of parliament in the new parliament, right? That is probably bigger than all the parliaments of the other East African countries combined, which is a big issue from a budgetary standpoint. And obviously that doesn't always translate into representation. But I think there have been attempts from the Resistance Council days, right, up to now, to represent different groups in the country. You know, whether that is, the differently abled, whether that is women who have been historically, marginalized from politics, whether that is the old as well, the elderly also have. I think the elderly have, the Ugandans in the room, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the elderly also have representation in parliament, so that all those groups are there.
Does that translate to policies that serve those marginalized groups?
Yes. I think there are policies, definitely. There are policies in place. How well they're implemented is a whole different issue altogether. Yeah, but I think Uganda we are very rich in policy. People actually complain that we have so many policies that our neighbors who are more effective at implementing always borrow from us, and then the difference is that they go and implement. Yeah.
Hello, I'm a Ugandan American, and I just had a few questions. I was thinking, right? Since Museveni has been in power for quite a long time, Uganda's lack of growth. What do you think would happen when he dies or gets couped? Do you think Uganda has enough alternative political institutions to fill in the vacuum? And with his death, what other factions do you think can fill in the void?
So my brother really went for the jugular. That's the big question right now in the country, right? What happens? Because our history, that is our recent history in the past 40 years, it's so enmeshed with the personality of Yoweri Museveni. So the question is, how do we move on from him? Now, obviously, everything in Ugandan society now has Museveni's touch, and he has made certain political decisions, even in negotiating the ruling coalition of the country, that sets quite a task for whoever will come after him. Now, I do not think that the man should die in power. I think that would be quite unfortunate for us, for some reasons, one being the inability to benefit from his political experience, but also two being the fact that it makes things a little bit unpredictable. I think that he has not done a good enough job, as he often cites Lee Kuan Yew, but I think he did not learn well enough from Lee Kuan Yew in setting in place and ensuring that you have not just one, but a cadre of people who have embraced your thought, who have internalized the objectives that you're trying to pursue, right? And they have been positioned and they understand what succession is going to look like from you. Because I don't subscribe to the notion that many people have that Museveni wants Uganda to plummet to the ground and go to hell. I don't think so. You can't go to the bush for 5 years and fight just so that what you build, dies after you die. But I think that he could have been much more intentional about, even within his own party, training people intentionally to be in a position to continue with this project. And he complains every time that there are no cadres within the NRM, that the people that he's working with are only after one thing, accumulating, eating the fruits of the revolution without building on it. So obviously there are now talks that his son could succeed him. He's going to contest elections. Apparently, that would mean that he has to step down from the army because he's within the military. We still have an opposition that needs to get its act together, right? And propose an agenda that's genuinely going to move Uganda forward. So I think it would be good for us if he oversaw a process through a democratic process that moves the country over from him. Because the man right now is tired physically and is tired intellectually. There's nothing new he has to say, right? I remember during you don't always have to have new things to say if what you're saying is right. So that is not it's not a statement against him, but it's just to say that he has to start seeing about how we can move on from him, right? And he's going to be critical to that process because, as we mentioned from the start and the conversation we're having with Mr. Haile at the start, we are not the first people to want Africa to move forward. We are not the first people to want Uganda to develop. And so it behooves us that we listen to and benefit very closely from the experience of the people who have actually tried. And so that's why he's going to be key to the process of transition in the country. But my brother, I wish I had very good answers for you. We can only pray and hope that we don't go back to what was before.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you after.
Yes, please.
I had a couple of questions, and then a couple of questions. I'm about 2/3 of the way through Silent Poison, and you commented that Museveni's foreign policy with regard to going into Somalia and the whole East African region, should the need arise, was based on the need to have a secure environment. But my understanding from what I'm reading is that in actuality, he's basically secured in many ways because of his collaboration with the U.S. And particularly with regard to South Sudan, where part of the goal of the U.S. In collaboration with the Israelis is to carry out what is referred to as a periphery process, whereby they try to destabilize any areas that are adjacent to or blended in with the borders of Arab or North African regimes that are Muslim, in order to secure Israeli goals and U.S. goals, imperialist goals in Western Asia and North Africa. And so I think there's a contradiction there. And I also understand from the Mamdani book that these local councils Museveni was insistent that they not be directly elected by the base, but that they be the the members of those local councils be elected by lower level delegates or councilors, something like that. But I also wanted just to say that with regard to the Russian Revolution, you said that the first thing that they did was form a strong state, and yes, they did have to repress the counter-revolutionary forces for sure. But one of the first things they did was they formed an international, a fighting international, because they recognized that no country is going to be able to essentially liberate working people unless it is part of an international effort, an organized one. And I think some of the reasons why there's been disenchantment from the notion of revolution is clearly the collapse of the Soviet Union, but it's also because so many revolutions that occurred did not follow some of the principal lessons that were drawn in the Russian Revolution. South Africa did not nationalize properties, and for instance, and I can't understand quite why the population, as Mamdani's book said, won the allegiance of the people in the face of all of the international stereotyping of him, because he did take away the properties and, in theory at least, was going to give them to the people. And why suddenly, the restitution of those properties to the Indians, why would that now be welcomed? What are the sources for the information that affirms all of the goods that you're positing that Museveni has achieved? And I'll stop there. I would like to actually comment on the whole idea of South Korea as being some sort of a model. I mean, there's a lot that could be said about that. They lost 80,000 people in a massacre at Gwangju in 1980 because of the uprising. Huge labor struggles, huge student struggles. Political prisoners that were in jail in South Africa for 70 years. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mom. I think those are very, very, very important issues. And to start with the last issue that you raised is actually not peripheral at all. It's very important. The question of can African states replicate the East Asian model? Now, there was a foundation in. That's also a big question. A friend of mine was writing on this about whether we actually want to replicate what China did in Africa. And that question is one that Africans barely ask themselves, including the urge to modernize. Do we actually want to modernize? And what does modernization look like for us? Right? We barely ask that question. We just assume, because, our problem is that we often embrace development as a project of mimicry. When you ask an African on the street, what should Uganda look like? The immediate answer, and that's not helped by the fact that the Ugandans like me here, is going to be that Uganda should look like America. But the problem is that you cannot just import America into Uganda. And when you do, you must know that it will come with its own, all the internal contradictions that we have in America now, all the problems that we have here. You know that if you even manage to successfully export a development agenda, it comes with that. Right? Whatever system you choose will come with its own issues. Marx used to speak of that base and superstructure and all of that. So we barely question the premise of modernization and what it means to be a modern society and what that will do to Africa itself. And the cost, actually, not just the economic cost, but the social social cost of modernizing, the social malaise of modernization, including what it has done to China. Right? China is a very different society now, and they're trying to navigate it. How do we still maintain our character as a nation while at the same time embracing all the fruits that come with capitalist development? And they are an important experiment that we can learn from. But just to go back to the question of if we concede the goal is to be like Korea or Singapore or what's the name of this country that's adjacent to China? I mean, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Hong Kong, I mean, is another tiger. If we consider that's the direction that we want to go, I want to argue that the international political economy has changed significantly, that Africa's ability to replicate what happened to them is significantly constrained. Even economically, how was South Korea able to achieve what it did? These guys had the patrimony of the United States of America. There was a confluence, and I write this in the book that, in my book that was mentioned earlier, there was a confluence of strategic factors, right? South Korea was of strategic value to the United States of America. And for a very long time, South Korea did not have to pay for its army because the USA was. So it was helped to get there. So there's this concept of development by permission. But how much strategic value does Uganda have to the US or to any other big power in the first place for it to throw that much money? I was talking with a friend about the fact that look at how much money that the US gives to Israel every year, just for being Israel. If you gave us that money in Uganda every year, even however corrupt we were, I'm sure we would move forward. Because we need money. Ultimately, it's a money issue, right? It's a money issue at the end of the day. So there is that question, can we actually replicate Singapore, South Korea in the current conditions? To the initial things that you brought up, Mom, let me see. So the question of, one, the resistance councils, right? How representative, how democratic were they? Obviously, I think Mamdani is more informed on what happened. He has been covering Uganda for quite a while and he knows the country. But I think that part of it is a multiplicity of factors why the resistance councils came into place. One of the biggest ones, beyond even just popular support, was legitimacy. Remember that how do you legitimize yourself as a new revolution? You have to show the people that you're a popular revolution. And that is why we are inviting popular participation from the grassroots. The mechanics of it, for example, democratic centralism and what instrument makes what decision, who elects what delegate to go where, now that is a different issue altogether. But part of why the NRM went the route of bringing local councils and resistance councils was also about, inviting popular participation to legitimize the regime. Because remember that the war was not fought in every part of the country. It was fought in the central region and a bit of the southern region of the country. So you have to now externalize that to the whole country and make sure they know that they're part of this new dispensation. And the only way that you do that, one of the things you can do is you can promulgate a new constitution, hence the 1996 constitution. Invite popular participation to make sure people know that we were a part of this project from day one. So that was part of it. There was another issue.
Well, I want to go. It might rotate around the same issue.
Oh, okay, sir.
The person here, the lady brought. First, I just think, ideas, lip servicing ideas, don't make ideas a reality. Who can bring what? Museveni could bring what? First, I think, let me just say this. My brother, you're very brilliant. I'm serious. I'm not buttering you. I'm not saying anything, but I just want to make sure my critical take cannot discourage. You're a brilliant brother. I'm proud that Africa is, generating young people like you guys. This is my first. I sit here owed to your intellectual dimension and capacity and analysis. But I think you have to really jump out of the Western modality of thinking or thought process. I think that is, preventing the best of your brain not to go into the area to bring you to a critical look at what we're facing in Africa. To me, Museveni was always, from day one, a missionary or a Christian feudal. I don't care if you say it's Marxism, socialism, I don't care. Mugabe was, the most Marxist, if you go by lip service, but he's the most Catholic, the most Christian leader ever faced in Africa. So there's this confusion of us Africans, and it happened certainly in Ethiopia. We take this doctrinary catechism as people who understood and digested it. And I think that especially you comparing it to the Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution, the Lenin and Bukharin and all this Russian revolutionaries come out a very different, oppressive, czarist, oppressive Russia, British imperialism, American imperialism. They come as a generation of people who've been tried by making mistakes of infantile revolution or, you know, or adventurous, his own brother being hanged for being anarchist, etc. So to me, the Russian Revolution is another ball of game. And the time you're talking about, especially eliminating the adversaries, etc., the Russian Revolution just became by historical process, okay? But the imperialists immediately surrounded and created forces to oppose the Russian revolutionaries. That's when violence kicked in. That's what gave birth to Stalin's coming into the picture. Okay, so I think you have the brain trust to go deeper. So we can really learn in Africa what is wrong with Angola, the Marxists in Angola. What is wrong with the South African Marxists? Where did they go? What is wrong with the, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cabral, the most, to me, the most, I think, liberated Marxist is Cabral, Fanon, etc. In a continent like that, why are we facing dictators like Museveni, an obscene expression of dictatorship and fascism? Okay? To me, at no time in history is he endowed to bring about a humanist system for peasants and poor people of Africa. Yes, he's serving the middle class, and his idea of development is false modernization, what you said yourself in terms of this high-rise bullshit. And Addis, the Ethiopian guy, is a good example. Just decorate the city and then deceive the world and get a name, but has nothing to do with, feeding and housing and sheltering the very core idea of socialism. Food, shelter, medicine, these things. And so for me, Uganda is a subsidized country. I'm sorry, my brother. Thanks to the CIA, she's doing well subsidized. Museveni cares about him. He makes the biggest financial revenue out of this whole oppressive situation Ugandan people are going through. And so I think we need to study more why our Marxists who believed in them did not live up to the idea of socialism or revolutionary idea in their own personal life. Most of these people are feudal. There's no Museveni could ever understood what he was reading. Walter Rodney, if he was alive, he would be writing about him the way Mandani is writing about him. So to me, my brother, you young people, as far as I'm concerned, you owe the history of what we are facing. I come from the Ethiopian student movement. The most, if you look at 1973, 72, the most Marxist in the whole continent of Africa, by Wall Street, testimony, the most Marxist university students were Ethiopians. Where are they now? They perished. And you know why? Because deep down they were feudal. They were never Marxist. Marxism is not like something you buy like tonic drink and you buy one book you are. It's a whole process, organic process that comes about. Okay? So for me, I think you should look at Museveni, good slip there, because they're the same for me, my brother, I'm sorry. They've left us with so many things. So to me, if he was insightful, Let me tell you, even if he cared about Nyerere, you talked about Nyerere, I think made a mistake on Uganda. But still, he's the one I respect. You know why? He's one leader who left the throne and said, "Let me see you young people go with it." Museveni, if he admires Nyerere, he should have left this position a long time ago. But he's like the Libyan guy, Gaddafi. He's going to be bloody in Uganda. There's going to be civil war in Uganda. We see it. It's like earthquake is about to happen, and you're waiting for it to happen before you exit. That's what he's doing, in my view. And this is what African leaders do, because you young people are not analyzing them beyond their lip service, beyond what they say. Catechism is not something you believe. The most Marxist, the first thing they come up with is the Ten Commandments. From what? The Holy Quran or Holy Christian Al-Qaeda. That's where it comes from. And to me, I think you should, as far as I'm concerned, you should critically analyze and say, is this a socialism orientation? What makes it so? What are the propositions? It's not because, to me, Bobby Wine is going to bring something new. I have myself at this time in my life, they're not African leaders that are going to bring about the remedy we African people are expecting for our people, because we confuse situation. Our idea of miseducation is taken as education. We read less those critical thinkers. A lot of the CIA books is what we read. I mean, we have here books historically written by real Pan-Africanists. So, you were saying he's Pan-African. He's not Pan-Africanist. Pan-Africanism does not do what he does. Pan-African is not anti-Africans. It's not. It's for pro-Africans. And they would be willing to give their life for that idea. Museveni is not that. Mugabe is not that. Anyway, thank you, my brother.
No, Muze, thank you.
I want to say to you this, because I forcefully spoke, I really sat here owed to you. To me, your kind of generation, now you should burn even my kind of old OGs. You should burn our disorientation, because for Africa, we the miseducated, Eurocentric Africans are the problem. And the idea is not big building. The development we are. It's not big edifice. The Haitian Revolution we were talking about, the Haitian Revolution, the problem with the Haitian Revolution was the revolutionaries want to think like white people. And the peasants left them and said, we just want land to feed our family. We don't want this plantation like in the image of white people. For black people, peasants in Haiti, plantation reminds them something crazy. But Toussaint Louverture, a revolutionary, this is how he thought. The modality of change and transformation and development is warped. Warped. To me, Uganda is North Korea by European definition, by African definition. North Korea. Uganda is North Korea. I mean, I'm not that I'm crazy about South Korea. It's another false democracy and dictatorship. But this North Korea openly to me. Thank you, my brother.
Thank you very much, Muze. Thank you, Muze Haile. I think that those are very important comments. I would say something just briefly, right, to that. One is to, now, we need to ask ourselves a question, right? I've read Marx, I've read these guys. That was the whole basis of the organization I mentioned to you, the movement, the fourth generation initiative, to say, how can we start thinking well about our problems, about our countries, to inform how we move forward, right? And I'll say this. I was recently reading Sankara, and this appears in Cabral, all these thinkers and all these people that acted and we look up to and we are proud of. And I'll tell you something, that we need to understand what the African Revolution is about. Obviously, the African Revolution, I agree with you, Muze, is not about superficial development. The African Revolution cannot be about a modernization that we've just imported from elsewhere, right? But we owe Marx nothing. I owe Karl Marx absolutely nothing. I owe Vladimir Lenin absolutely nothing. I only owe him to the extent that his ideas are useful in helping me understand the dispensation that I exist in and to move my life forward. I've read Marx, I've read Lenin, I've read Mao, and now what we are saying to ourselves is, can we read Museveni? Can we read Nyerere? Can we read Cabral? Can we read Sankara in this country? Can we read people who have gone against the state to advance this thing? What I'm saying is, what is the African Revolution about? And I think Nyerere defined it well. It's about the three freedoms. One, national freedom, for sure. As African countries, we want to be able to make our own decisions without interference from anybody and anywhere else. Two, definitely personal freedoms. In the positive sense, freedom to advance ourselves forward without interference from anybody else. And then Nyerere mentioned this very well. Freedom from hunger, freedom from disease, freedom from poverty. And that means that any revolution in Africa and anywhere in the world should be pro-people. And I agree with you, Muse, and what you're saying, that we should be thinking about how well has the NRA revolution served the people at the grassroots? How well has it served to advance the interests of every Ugandan? Now, to think about that question, and I'll push back on something that you mentioned at the start, Muse. The Ugandans and Africans, they are not, the revolution is not a spiritual one. Let's leave the idea of the spiritual revolution to the determination of the people themselves. We should know what politics is about. And politics is about shared and collective interests. In a country like Uganda, we have Christians, we have Muslims, we have people who adhere to traditional African religions, we have people who adhere to different kinds of belief systems. And I think they're entitled to those beliefs to the extent that those beliefs don't curtail national development. We can't spiritualize the African revolution. What is the interest, the collective interest that we are pursuing as a country? It's the interest of a country that works to enable everybody to live freely. We want to see our children go to school. We want to see our children free from diseases that they should not be suffering from. We want to see everybody access basic health care. And in any case, if things go abroad, they can access free health care without having to fly their relatives off to India. We want to see a situation where in Africa, people can practice whatever whatever religion you choose to practice, that is your own. And you have to give credit to Museveni, however much we like or do not like him, that these are ideas that he has advocated for a long time against ideological confusion. That we're not going to run our country as a Muslim country. We're not running our country as a Christian country. We are running a country that adheres to the interests of everyone. And to that extent, we owe Lenin nothing. We owe Mao nothing. We owe Marx nothing. We just owe them to the extent that they contribute ideas that serve to advance us. Is Uganda a subsidized country? Yes. Because more than half of our budget is contributed by actors that are not Ugandan. And that is because we're a poor country. So now the question, the more important question is, now when we say poor, Muse,
The wealth we have, why are they dying? Europeans and Americans, the Israelis, why are they want Africa to remain as it? Because of the wealth we have. So to me, we're not poor country. We have to redirect our idea of wealth, my brother.
Muse, I agree with you totally. That and I qualified this during the discussion, that when I say that we're a poor country, I don't mean we are not wealthy. We are very resource rich. And this is the premise for the Pan-Africanism that we are advocating for. That how do we leverage the economic resources that we have? One of the economic policies that in Uganda today has been advanced is the fact that we don't want to export any minerals from the country that has been unprocessed. That is very important because think about the Congo, and Muse, you know this very well. The fact that this current whole green transition and revolution is being financed by countries like that. All the minerals, all these things that we have in our mobile phones and all these devices, the coltan and phosphates and all of this is coming from Africa. So we have the resources. We are a very wealthy continent. We are a very resource-rich continent. But we failed to translate that into resources that can be used to advance us. All these countries are in debt. Zambia is in debt. Ghana is defaulting. Kenya, debt to GDP ratio 76%. Uganda is heading towards debt distress. Why? Because we've not managed to translate that wealth into materials that we can use to move us forward. So it's not a spiritual revolution.
Sorry, my brother. One more point there. I think the resource is there. We agree now. But I think our idea of development, this false sense of development, what it does is makes us think development is in the formula of the Euro-colonialist tradition. We do not identify new identity of development departing from our regional country enrichment. Whatever our sources, our development or growth comes from our identity, from our wealth, from our rich. What are we rich? Oil or what? What are we? Then we empower that, or we take over that, control of that, and develop from that end. And instead of importing development, I call it false development. To me, I think modernization is very deceptive, because when we think modernization, it becomes glittering item importation, car, earrings, which creates a middle class power that lives off of a dictatorship that we have in Africa. So for me, where I would say to you is, I think, to me, it's not begging that relieves us or getting from outside, but developing our own real, hand on earth wealth, and then build our idea of development from that, and modernize that resource within the image of our own individual country's identity.
Muse, again, I agree with you. You're very spot on. I think there's a reason why you're the elder in the room. You're very spot on that we give very little thought, and I agree with you, that we give very little thought to the kind of developmentalist vision and ambition that we set for ourselves as African countries. Everywhere that the president of Uganda goes, he says, oh, we are backward countries. Now, we can talk about why that can be problematic, but he's talking about it in economic terms, the fact that we are not as industrialized as the West. And that is the modality of development that we've chosen to subscribe to. And I remember it's Fanon who said this, that if all we want to do is to be like the West, then why did we remove those guys in the first place? We should have just let them stay, and they would modernize us, and they would do a much better job than because if we, and that's what has been, that most African countries, when they look at the West, Europe, they see the mirror image of their future, right? And that's not to say that everything in the West is bad. It's obviously, the technical efficiency is good. It has had its impacts on the climate, and we must pay very careful attention to that. Climate change is a big problem, right? But we cannot reject everything. But we're saying that if we want to embrace wholesale the Western style modernization that we are having, then that's going to be a problem for us. And it would have been better if we just let white people run our countries for us, because they could do a better job of getting us there than we can do it ourselves. So, Mose, I agree with you in the concerns about how we conceive of what development should be like. I am worried, though, that Africans have internalized the logics of modernity too much, particularly because our middle class has a very large sway on the popular imagination, and because of also the hegemony of the West through media. So any young African who is growing up, they have a certain vision. You can easily internalize self-hate, right? And you begin to despise yourself and your society, and you think that the Western model is the one, and that modernity with all its underpinnings, rationality, all of that is the way to go. And I think that that's a big problem that we need to watch against. So, Mose, I agree with you. I agree with you. Thank you very much.
Sorry, folks. Immediately after Amin, although when Amin betrayed the Israelis and the British, immediately the CIA and all the Mossad and all of them, the scramble to find a leader gives in to Museveni. I think you could do more research there to enlighten us. For me, I know that was a critical historical juncture, because even for Museveni, 5 years It's not dialectically, long time enough to develop and make organic your political idea if he did have. To me, years and years, like, NATO if you take NATO, Mandelain of Mozambique, NATO of Angola, Samara Michel, etc. You find these Africans for over 20, 30 years, Cabral studied the idea of changing Africa into away from independence movement to a liberation movement. And so that scramble of the Mossad, Israel, England, and the United States, using the voodoo hoodoo of the Asian issue still is mystified, because I do not buy it, because we always have a target, either a tribe or something. It's the way the exploiters, the new powers come in, and that's critical for any Ugandan I want to learn from. I want them to circle that period, and I really want to see more research done, what the CIA and Mossad, Israel, and Britain, who brought Idi Amin, who betrayed them, and then Abote, and then Museveni comes in the picture. So for me, in that period of Tanzania, there is a circle we should make and say, what happened there really? Who now is playing the hidden hand, the big hand behind the force, the so-called the liberation movement that came into becoming the standing army of Museveni. Thank you so much. I push so much because I think you should do, I want you to do more homework and teach us, in my view.
Thank you, Musei. That's your work, Musei, to make sure that we don't reify in terms of our thought. I'll just mention this quickly, that Sankara is, we normally, when we think about revolutionary leadership that delivers, we often talk about Sankara, right, with his politics. Now, obviously, all that generation, the Sankaras and all of that, they will tell you about how they were not pro-East, pro-West, but they were pro-Africa, right? And that's the posture that Museveni has maintained as well. Oftentimes, it's not hard to think, and you mentioned well with Museveni that he needs to be taken seriously. And it's one thing to say, right, who he is and what he has done, and it's another thing to also critique that. But he needs to be taken seriously because of 40 years of being at the helm of a post-colonial state, or you can say a neo-colonial state in an African context. Uganda is not very special in Africa. We are just like a lot of other African countries, right? Maybe with particular internal dynamics, but we are very similar to other countries. He likes to say we should not compare pygmies. Uganda is very similar to Kenya, very similar to Tanzania, maybe even Ethiopia. We may have different geographical configurations, different groups, and some of these groups, they came from one another, but we're not very unique. So I think the interesting question for me and for my generation is, what can we learn from Museveni? And Musei, we were having this conversation in the beginning about our generation not being so unique, because if tomorrow, I always ask people this question, if tomorrow I became president of Uganda, what am I going to do that is so different from what has been done now? And how is it going to bear different results? Because remember, men make their own history, as Marx said, but not under self-selected circumstances. And we can think about that in the African context today. You're not just... Museveni talks about how he wanted to bring Nestle to... is it Nestle or Nesso? Nestle, right? Yeah. To Uganda to come and... Because we are one of the biggest exporters of coffee, to Uganda to build an industrial plant. And throughout the 40 years, there's no industrial plant from Nestle in Uganda. And that doesn't make sense. Ethiopia, Uganda, these are countries that should be processing coffee internally and exporting the final product. But you think about countries like Germany, which don't grow any coffee, and the fact that in the coffee value chain, they take a lot of the money. Now, those are hard economic facts that you have to face, right? That we have to build somehow. And maybe this is where the question of self-sufficiency comes in. How do we pool resources internally together to now build our own capacity to compete globally? So we don't have to depend on foreign capital to advance our interests. So one can think of because Museveni and Sankara they occurred in the same time. It came in 86, Sankara, 73? 83 rather. That's when Sankara 87 is when he was taken out, But I think he's, because of if you talk about ideas alone, his Sankara will live to tell the tale. And who transitioned from a revolutionary politics to bourgeois pragmatism. He became pragmatic for survival because he realized very early on that if I'm to survive in this water of sharks, I have to play a different kind of game. But I think that even in that revolutionary flexibility, if you are to call it, one thing that we're going to judge him by is how well he has done for the man at the grassroots. That test does not fail. And Muse, I think that was a good perspective you brought back.
Let's
We
give him
have
a
to-
round of applause. One more question? One more, okay.
One more
We can do
question,
one more
then we'll
question.
wrap.
I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. I think that the Marxist position on anthropomorphic religions is not at all to disrespect people's right to worship as they choose. I mean, that should be sacrosanct. I'm a Marxist and I believe that. I die for somebody's right to be a Catholic, and I'm pro-choice. So, but the point is that we believe that probably with gains in knowledge, let's just say that religion, as we know it now, it might wither away is the term, or it would definitely be very changed from some beliefs that are now taken as standard. So to clarify that, I don't think that it's a matter of, I think that what we're talking about is that revolutionary leaders have to embrace, look at Marxism as a tool. It's a methodology. It's a way of analyzing a society. And the conclusions that people will reach are going to be different for every society based on the particular needs of that society to have the essential goods and services available to them of healthcare, education, housing, sanitation, transportation, recreation, you name it, security of all kinds. And it's going to be somewhat different for every society. It's a creative methodology if it's properly viewed. But I do think that you said that you don't owe anything to Marxists, and I really think maybe you need to look at your history. As a woman, I can tell you Marxism and Marxist parties. I haven't been in a party for 30 years, so I'm not trying to recruit to any particular party. But there are huge problems of sexism and racism, and the more I learn about one, the more I learn about the other. So they are not perfect for sure, and they won't be in my lifetime. But if you read the books they sell here, which is where I bought them, by Hakim Adi on Pan-Africanism and communism, there was a huge influence on Pan-Africanism from communists. C.L.R. James, was Trotskyist. And so you can't, everything we think now, nothing comes from a vacuum. And we need to really be aware of the influences on ourselves and not to just throw out these ideas. That's really awful. But what the main thing, I'm sorry, I know I'm taking time. It's almost like you're seeing the question of development and industry in this vacuum. I mean, there is a reason why. I mean, didn't Rodney, write a book on the underdevelopment of Africa? It's a deliberate policy. The industrialized countries that control all these lending institutions, they want you to be in debt. Yeah. They want the African and all the countries in the global south to be in debt. Yeah. They want you to be strangled because they want your cheap labor, the raw materials, the commodity markets for things produced in the advanced industrialized countries. They want it that way. Yeah. And they recognize every sign that you're going to come out of, that anybody will come out of that situation with an idea that they need to be opposed and really overthrown. Yeah. I mean, And just one last thing. I would urge people, if they can, go online and look at the monthly review of May, June 2017, because they talk about there's a great article called The Fourth Pillar of Imperialism, and it's about how nonprofits and these NGOs are being set up in African countries in order to siphon off the best and the brightest that used to think about revolution. Now they'll get the corporate class has figured out that they can give them billions. And so they'll set up these NGOs, which actually do some good, but only for, even if it's for 1 million people in one country, that's a fraction of what could be done. So they co-opt, and they do it here too. Everybody's ahead of a nonprofit now.
Yes, ma'am. I'll just say this very, very quickly. Thank you very much for that. I'll just maybe to qualify that statement about not owing Marx or Lenin anything. Obviously, it would be dishonest to say that that Marx and Lenin and all those people in the Marxist tradition were not very informative. One for the African liberation movement. You know, Nkrumah has read Marx. Cabral has read Marx. Sankara has read Marx in Madagascar and in France. Cabral has read Marx later on, right? So all these guys definitely, and Museveni has read Marx very obviously. So when I talked about we don't owe them anything, just to clarify very quickly, I meant it in terms of we learn from Marx, and we have to acknowledge his contribution. I still believe he's maybe the most incisive critic of capitalism, and that's what we need to acknowledge. But we can't deify him. Marx is not God, right? Lenin is not God. So that means that we extract and we apply, I love the word you use, the methodological tool of analysis. We use their ideas as a lens through which to make sense of our reality in order to advance. And we also have to acknowledge the limitation of that lens, and where it complements with what we already believe, that's important. So we don't owe him just to the extent of he's not God, we're not going to worship him, but we'll learn from him.
But I want everybody, before you leave, in case you're running, this young man here, he has the audacity to have memoirs already. So, to me, I think we should support him. It's a good way of germinating the best of our people. So if you haven't got it, it's in the back. Get it. He would sign for you. This might be serious collector's item. You know, where you don't know where this kid is going. So thank you again. But you close it. I just wanted to announce the book.
Thank you, Mzee.
Okay. And you can close it, my sister. Sorry, interrupting.
No worries. Okay, let's give Olemo a round of applause. Just really insightful, really knowledgeable. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for all the discussions that we had even prior in planning this conversation. Really appreciate you being here with us, sharing your book with us, sharing your knowledge and your perspective with us, and encouraging our discussion. So thank you.
And also, we will match him back again. His match is the brother who's missing. The two of them would have been, so we still will call you back. You're not going to escape the brother who's your elder, I'm sure, but very compatible with you too, because he's from Uganda also. And I hope you can come back again to be with him and moderating quickly the two of them, okay? So I'm sorry, I'm keep interrupting.
I think that's a wrap. Thank you to Sankofa. Thank you to you guys for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. And thank you to the 625 for being Kenyan and loving East Africans and wanting to learn everything about our neighbors. We make new friends every day, and we're excited we might be going into Tanzania next, so stay tuned.